Marcia stood frozen as Rodrigo stepped forward, his sharp gaze no longer carrying its usual coldness, but holding something deeper, a decision that could change her life forever. The first rays of sunlight barely kissed the horizon when Marcia stirred awake, her small, dimly lit room already alive with the soft hum of the morning. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and faint mildew, a testament to the years of neglect the house had endured. Through the thin walls, the faint coughing of her mother echoed, a reminder of the burden Marcia bore on her young shoulders. "Mara, be careful today," her mother's weak voice called out from the adjoining room. Marcia turned to face her mother, her heart tightening as she caught sight of her frail figure bundled under a patched quilt. Her mother's face, once vibrant and full of life, now carried the weariness of years spent battling illness. "I'll be careful, Mom," Marcia replied softly, her voice steady yet tinged with determination. She leaned over, brushing a gentle kiss against her mother's forehead before heading to the small space she shared with her younger siblings. The room was cluttered but orderly, a reflection of Marcia's efforts to maintain a semblance of stability despite their dire circumstances. Her siblings slept soundly, their peaceful expressions a stark contrast to the harsh reality they lived in. Marcia moved carefully, so as not to wake them, and slipped into her worn-out dress. The hem had been mended so many times it bore a patchwork of mismatched threads. Her sandals, too large for her feet, flapped noisily as she walked. Near the door, her basket of flowers awaited. She had spent the previous evening meticulously arranging the blossoms, salvaging whatever wild flowers she could find in the overgrown lots nearby. Each petal carried her hopes and her fears, the vivid colors a testament to her resilience. Stepping outside, Marcia was greeted by the cool embrace of the morning air. The streets of her neighborhood were eerily quiet, the stillness broken only by the distant bark of a dog. The houses around her, much like her own, were dilapidated and weary, standing as silent witnesses to the struggles of the families within. Marcia began her walk to the bustling city streets, the soles of her sandals kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. As she passed familiar corners, neighbors offered her small nods of encouragement, their faces lined with the same hardships. "Morning, Marcia," called out Mr. Thompson, the grocer whose shop had long since closed. He leaned against the doorframe of his boarded-up store, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she replied, offering a small, polite smile. By the time Marcia reached the edge of the city, the world had awakened. The streets buzzed with activity, the cacophony of vendors shouting their wares mingling with the clatter of carriages and hurried footsteps. To Marcia, this chaos was both daunting and promising, a chance to earn the money she so desperately needed for her mother's medicine. She found her usual spot near the corner of a busy market square. It was far from prime, overshadowed by larger stalls, but Marcia knew the city well enough to catch the fleeting moments when a passerby's eyes lingered just long enough on her flowers. "Fresh flowers brighten your day with a bloom," she called, her voice bright despite her exhaustion. She held up a small bouquet, her fingers trembling slightly from the morning chill. A man in a crisp suit passed by, glancing down at her basket with mild interest. "How much?" he asked, his tone brisk but not unkind. "Just 2 coins, sir," Marcia replied, hope lighting up her eyes. The man fished into his pocket, producing the coins with a nod before taking the bouquet. "Keep at it, kid," he said as he walked away. The coins felt heavy in her palm, their metallic coolness grounding her resolve. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Marcia tucked them into a small pouch tied to her dress, careful to secure it tightly. Each coin was a lifeline, a step closer to easing her mother's pain. Hours passed, and Marcia's voice grew hoarse. The sun climbed higher, its warmth bearing down on her. Her feet ached from standing, and her stomach growled in protest, but she pressed on. Occasionally, a kind soul would stop to buy a flower or two, offering her words of encouragement or a sympathetic smile. By midday, her basket was half empty, and Marcia allowed herself a brief moment of rest. She sat on the edge of a fountain, the cool mist from the water offering a momentary reprieve. As she stared into the rippling pool, she thought of her mother and siblings, their faces giving her the strength to continue. In the distance, she spotted a wealthy woman, her attire immaculate and her presence commanding attention. Marcia instinctively rose, clutching a particularly vibrant bouquet. The woman's eyes flicked to Marcia, her gaze lingering before she approached. "Those are beautiful," the woman remarked, her voice smooth and melodic. Marcia offered her brightest smile. "Thank you, ma'am. They're just 2 coins. The woman studied her for a moment, then reached into her purse, pulling out a crisp note, far exceeding the price. "Keep the change," she said, handing Marcia the money along with a kind smile. "Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new information." Marcia's breath caught as she accepted the note, her hands trembling. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much." As the woman walked away, Marcia clutched the money to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of her worries begin to lift, however slightly. This was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, but Marcia knew she would find a way. For her mother, for her siblings, for hope. Marcia stood at her spot in the bustling market, clutching her basket of flowers tightly. The noonday sun blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cobblestones. Beads of sweat rolled down her forehead, but she refused to let exhaustion show on her face. Today was too important to give in to weariness. The faint scent of her flowers mixed with the earthy tang of the marketplace, yet few seemed to notice her wares. "Flowers, ma'am. Only 5 rays," Marcia called out, her voice bright with practiced enthusiasm. She stepped toward a middle-aged woman dressed in fine clothes and holding a parasol. The woman's gaze flicked to Marcia for a brief second before she turned away, her parasol spinning slightly as she walked on. Marcia's hand fell to her side, the rose she held wilting slightly under the weight of her disappointment. The streets buzzed with life, vendors shouting over each other to hawk their goods, children weaving through the crowd, and carriages rattling past. But to Marcia, it felt as if she were invisible. "Fresh flowers. They'll brighten your day." She tried again, this time offering a wide smile to a man in a crisp jacket, walking with a purposeful stride. He didn't slow down, his eyes fixed straight ahead as though she didn't exist. Each rejection chipped away at her resolve, but Marcia wasn't one to quit. The image of her mother, weak and coughing in their small home, propelled her forward. She adjusted her grip on the basket and approached a group of women standing near a fruit stall. "Excuse me, ladies," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps you'd like a flower for your table? Just 5 rayas for a beautiful bloom." The women exchanged glances, one of them chuckling under her breath. "No, thank you," the tallest of them said curtly, her tone dismissive. They turned their backs, continuing their conversation as if Marcia had never spoken. "Thank you anyway," Marcia whispered, her shoulders sagging slightly as she stepped away. Her fingers brushed over the flowers in her basket, each petal a symbol of her determination. She refused to give up, but the weight of rejection bore down on her like a heavy stone. Hours passed, and the crowd ebbed and flowed, yet Marcia's basket remained stubbornly full. The coins she'd managed to collect earlier rattled against the empty pouch at her hip, a cruel reminder of how far she still had to go. As the afternoon dragged on, the oppressive heat made her head throb. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and scanned the bustling street. That's when she spotted him, a man unlike the others she'd approached today. He stood out even in the busy marketplace, his sharp suit perfectly tailored, his polished shoes gleaming in the sunlight. Rodrigo. Marcia had heard whispers of Rodrigo from other vendors, a wealthy businessman known for his cold demeanor and sharp tongue. He was walking briskly, his attention seemingly fixed on a piece of paper in his hand. Despite his imposing presence, Marcia's desperation drove her forward. She darted into his path, clutching a single rose in her trembling hand. "Please, sir," she called, her voice ringing with a mix of urgency and hope. "Just one flower, only 5 reas." Rodrigo stopped in his tracks, his gaze falling on her like a heavy weight. His piercing eyes, cold and calculating, swept over her small frame, her worn-out dress, and the basket clutched tightly in her hands. For a moment, Marcia felt her breath hitch, her usual confidence faltering under his scrutiny. He raised a brow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "A flower?" he asked, his tone laced with disdain. Marcia nodded eagerly, stepping closer and holding the rose out to him. "Yes, sir. It's fresh and beautiful. Please, it's only 5 reas." Rodrigo's eyes lingered on the rose for a fleeting second before flicking back to her face. "And what would I do with a flower?" he asked, his voice as cold as his gaze. Without waiting for an answer, he turned on his heel and strode away, the click of his polished shoes echoing against the cobblestones. Marcia stood frozen, the rose still outstretched in her hand. Her heart sank, her chest tightening with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. The rejection stung more deeply than the others, not because of what he had said, but because of the way he'd looked at her, as if she were nothing. Blinking back tears, Marcia straightened her shoulders and tucked the rose back into her basket. The marketplace continued to buzz around her, oblivious to the small drama that had just unfolded. But in that moment, Marcia felt a flicker of defiance spark within her. She clenched her fists, silently vowing to keep going. She approached another passerby, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Flowers, sir." "Just 5 reas." The man shook his head and walked on without a word. Marcia didn't stop. One after another, she tried again and again. Some ignored her, others offered pitying smiles, and a few even muttered harsh words about beggars clogging the streets. But through it all, she kept moving, her basket a little lighter, her heart a little heavier. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the marketplace in hues of gold and amber, Marcia had sold only a handful of flowers. Her feet ached, her throat was dry, and the coins in her pouch jingled faintly as she walked. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough for the medicine her mother needed. But Marcia refused to let despair take hold. As the crowd began to thin, she found a quieter corner to rest, leaning against a cool stone wall. The basket rested beside her, its contents dwindling but still unsold. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the evening breeze wash over her face. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the hum of the marketplace, "tomorrow will be better." And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Marcia clung to that thought, her resolve stronger than ever. The next morning, Marcia returned to the marketplace with renewed determination. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her mind, but she refused to let them deter her. The coins jingling in her pouch were still far from what she needed, but the thought of her mother's frail smile gave her the strength to press on. The sun was climbing higher when she spotted Rodrigo again. He was standing near a lavish cafe on the edge of the market square, his sharp suit as immaculate as before. He seemed engrossed in conversation with another man, his posture radiating authority. Marcia hesitated, her heart pounding. The memory of his cold rejection stung, but desperation and hope burned brighter. Clutching a single rose, Marcia steadied her breath and approached him once more, Her sandals slapped softly against the cobblestones as she closed the distance between them. "Sir!" she called out, her voice steady but soft. Rodrigo turned, his sharp gaze landing on her. She hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping forward. "Please, just one flower. My mother needs medicine." Rodrigo raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "How much?" "5 rays, sir," Marcia replied, holding the rose out to him. For a moment, Rodrigo didn't move. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp 50 Ries note. He extended it toward her. "Keep the change." Marcia stared at the note, her heart sinking rather than soaring. She stepped back, shaking her head. "No, sir. Please just buy the flower. I don't want charity." Her words hung in the air, surprising even herself. Rodrigo's brow furrowed slightly as he studied her, his hand still outstretched. Slowly, he took the rose from her trembling hand and placed the note back in his pocket. "You're a peculiar one," Rodrigo said quietly, his voice tinged with a note of curiosity. "Thank you, sir," Marcia replied, bowing her head slightly, her dignity intact. She turned to leave, but a commotion nearby drew both of their attention. A burly security guard was marching toward her, his face set in a stern scowl. "Miss," he barked, his voice booming over the chatter of the marketplace, "you can't sell here. This is private property." Marcia stiffened, her grip tightening on her basket. "Please, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to sell flowers for my mother. She's sick and I need to buy her medicine." The guard crossed his arms, glaring down at her. "Rules are rules. You'll have to leave." Before Marcia could respond, Rodrigo stepped forward. His commanding presence silenced the guard mid-sentence. "Leave her alone," Rodrigo said, his tone firm and unwavering. "She's not hurting anyone." The guard hesitated, glancing between Rodrigo and Marcia. "Sir, this is... I don't care," Rodrigo interrupted, his cold gaze silencing the guard once more. "I said leave her alone." Reluctantly, the guard muttered something under his breath before retreating, casting Marcia one last disapproving glance. She exhaled shakily, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, sir," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Rodrigo turned back to her, his expression softer than before. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost curious. "Shouldn't you be in school?" Marcia hesitated, glancing down at her worn sandals. "I can't," she admitted. "My mother is sick. I have to take care of her and my brothers. If I don't sell flowers, we won't have enough for her medicine." Rodrigo regarded her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Then, to Marcia's surprise, he gestured toward a nearby bench. "Sit," he said. "Tell me more." She hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but the exhaustion in her limbs and the kindness in his voice swayed her. Marcia sat down, clutching her basket tightly as she spoke. "My father died when I was little," she began, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "After that, things got harder. My mother worked as much as she could, but when she got sick," her voice faltered and she looked down at her hands. "She can't work anymore. I'm the oldest, so it's my job to take care of everyone." Rodrigo listened intently, his sharp features softening with every word she spoke. "How old are you?" he asked. 13, Marcia replied, "but I feel much older." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Rodrigo's mouth. I imagine you do." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the marketplace fading into the background. Rodrigo leaned back slightly, his gaze distant. "You remind me of someone," he said after a pause. "Who?" Marcia asked, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Rodrigo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Extracting another 50 Ries note, he held it out to her. "Take this," he said firmly. "It's not charity, it's payment for the flowers I'll buy from you every day." Marcia stared at the note, her heart racing. "Every day?" "Every day," Rodrigo confirmed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll meet me here, and I'll buy as many flowers as you can carry. Do we have a deal?" Her lips parted in surprise, but no words came out. She glanced at his outstretched hand, then at the flowers in her basket. Slowly, a smile broke across her face. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you." Rodrigo nodded, his expression unreadable once more. "Good. Now go home and get some rest. You've worked hard enough for one day." As Marcia rose from the bench, her basket suddenly felt lighter. For the first time in a long while, hope burned brightly in her chest. She clutched the money tightly, her mind already racing with thoughts of how it could help her family. "Thank you, sir," she said again, her voice firm and sincere. Rodrigo watched her go, his gaze lingering long after she disappeared into the crowd. Something about the young girl's resilience had stirred something within him, a memory, a feeling he thought he'd buried long ago. For Marcia, the world seemed a little brighter as she made her way back home. The burden on her shoulders felt lighter, not just because of the money Rodrigo had given her, but because she had found a spark of kindness in a world that often seemed so cruel. This wasn't the end of her struggle, Marcia knew that, but it was a start, and sometimes a small start was all that was needed to change everything. Marcia returned to the marketplace the next day, her basket lighter than it had been in weeks, yet her spirits buoyed by the thought of Rodrigo's unexpected kindness. True to his word, he was there, waiting, leaning casually against a lamppost near their agreed-on meeting spot. As she approached, she noticed something different in his demeanor, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, sir," she greeted, her voice warm as she offered him a small bouquet of freshly picked daisies. Rodrigo nodded in acknowledgement, accepting the flowers without hesitation. As he did, his gaze lingered on her face, noting the tired shadows under her eyes and the faint tremor in her hands. "You didn't sleep, did you?" he asked, his voice low but pointed. Marcia glanced away, fiddling with the hem of her dress. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone determined. "I had to finish getting everything ready for today." Rodrigo frowned, his sharp features hardening. "You can't keep doing this," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a man used to giving orders. "It's too dangerous. You're a child, Marcia, selling flowers on the street, dodging guards. It's not right." Marcia's head snapped up, her pride sparking in her eyes. "I'm not asking for handouts," she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. "I don't want charity, Rodrigo. I just want a chance. A real chance to help my family." Her words hung between them, charged with raw emotion. Rodrigo's jaw tightened and he exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. And what happens if you get hurt?" he demanded. "If you get sick? Who will take care of your mother and your brothers then?" Marcia's silence spoke volumes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Rodrigo stepped closer, his voice softening. "Let me help you," he said. "Not with charity, with a plan." Marcia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the basket's handle. The conflict within her was palpable, the fierce independence that had carried her this far, battling against the flicker of hope his offer ignited. Finally, she gave a small nod. "What kind of plan?" Rodrigo's lips curved into a faint smile. "Come with me." The bustling marketplace gave way to quieter streets as Rodrigo led Marcia through the city, They passed grand buildings and busy storefronts until they reached a modest brick building nestled between two larger establishments. A faded sign above the door read, "St. Helena's Community Center." Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the chill of the outside world. Families gathered in small groups, children played in a corner, and volunteers bustled about, carrying supplies and offering assistance. Marcia glanced around, her curiosity mingled with unease. "Rodrigo, what is this place?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "This," Rodrigo said, gesturing around, "is where people get the help they need without having to fight for it alone." A woman approached them, her kind eyes crinkling with a warm smile. She was older, her hair streaked with silver, but there was an energy about her that seemed to fill the room. Rodrigo greeted her with a nod. "Donna Elena," he said. "This is Marcia." Donna Helena extended a hand to Marcia, who hesitated briefly before shaking it. "It's lovely to meet you, Marcia," she said, her voice gentle and reassuring. "Rodrigo has told me a little about you." And Marcia glanced at Rodrigo, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "He did?" Donna Helena nodded, her expression softening. "He said you're a brave young girl who's been carrying far too much on her shoulders. He thought we might be able to help." Marcia's throat tightened, the enormity of the moment threatening to overwhelm her. "Help? How?" she managed to ask. Donna Helena gestured toward a nearby table, inviting them to sit. "First, we'll make sure your mother gets the treatment she needs. We have doctors who volunteer here, and they can evaluate her condition. From there, we'll figure out a plan to get her the care she needs. And while we're at it, we can support your family. Food, clothes, school supplies for your siblings. You don't have to do this alone, Marcia." The words struck something deep within Marcia, the walls she had carefully built around her heart, trembling under the weight of Donna Helena's kindness. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, tears welled in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. Rodrigo, who had been standing silently nearby, stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to let people help, Marcia," he said softly. "You've done enough." Marcia wiped at her cheeks, a mixture of relief and vulnerability washing over her. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Donna Helena reached across the table, taking Marcia's hand in hers. "You don't have to thank us, dear. You just have to let us help." Later that afternoon, Marcia and Rodrigo walked together toward her neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city streets. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcia felt a sense of lightness, a glimmer of hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. "What did you do this?" she asked suddenly, glancing up at Rodrigo. "Why did you help me?" Rodrigo was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because someone once helped me," he said finally. "When I was a boy, not much older than you, I was in a situation not so different from yours. Someone believed in me, gave me a chance. It changed everything." Marcia studied him, her curiosity deepening. "Who was it?" Rodrigo smiled faintly. "Doña Helena," he admitted. "She saw something in me that no one else did. She gave me the tools to build a better life. I owe her everything." Marcia nodded, her admiration for him growing. "You're a good man, Rodrigo." Rodrigo chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm just returning the favor," he said, "and someday you'll do the same for someone else." As they reached her home, Marcia turned to Rodrigo, her expression serious. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for everything." Rodrigo nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "This is just the beginning, Marcia. We're going to make sure you and your family are taken care of." As Marcia stepped inside her house, the warm glow of the setting sun spilling into the doorway, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of kindness. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. A chapter where she and her family could finally see a way forward. And for Marcia, that was more than she had ever dared to dream. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change for Marcia and her family. With Rodrigo and Donna Helena's help, Marcia's mother was brought to the clinic at St. Helena's Community Center. The doctors there, kind and attentive, conducted thorough examinations and began treatment immediately. For the first time in years, Marcia's mother received proper medical care, her frail body no longer having to bear the brunt of untreated illness. I knew all along that I had to let go of control when I lifted the uncontrollable and left. I can't go back to a life before or after Sally. Marcia watched from the corner of the room, relief washing over her as the color slowly returned to her mother's cheeks. The weight on her shoulders felt lighter, though the journey was far from over. She knew she still had much to do, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. A few days later, Rodrigo met Marcia at the bustling market. This time, he didn't lead her to the familiar corners where she had struggled to sell her flowers. Instead, he guided her to a small stall nestled between two established vendors. The wooden structure was simple but sturdy, with a clean counter and hooks to display her flowers. "This is for you," Rodriguez said, gesturing toward the stall. His voice was steady, but there was a faint trace of pride in his expression. Marcia's eyes widened, her hands covering her mouth in disbelief. "For me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rodrigo nodded. "You'll be safe here," he assured her. "No one will bother you anymore. The market management knows about your situation, and you're welcome to work here as long as you need." Marcia ran her fingers over the smooth counter, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," Rodrigo replied with a soft smile. "Just keep being the hard-working person you are. That's more than enough." Marcia set down her basket, arranging her flowers on the counter with care. As she worked, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. This was her space, a place where she could work without fear of being chased away or ignored. "Thank you, sir," she said, turning back to Rodrigo. Her smile was wide, her gratitude genuine. Rodrigo's expression softened. "You're welcome, Marcia. You've earned this." As Marcia settled into her new routine, another conversation awaited her. A conversation about her future. One afternoon, Rodrigo introduced her to Ana, a cheerful social worker with kind eyes and an infectious energy. Ana had been following Marcia's story through Donna Helena and Rodrigo, and she was eager to help. "Marcia," Ana began, her tone gentle yet encouraging. "Rodrigo and I have been talking about your education. We know you've had to sacrifice a lot to take care of your family, but we believe it's time you had a chance to focus on yourself, too." Marcia's brow furrowed slightly. "My education?" she repeated, her voice hesitant. Ana nodded, her smile unwavering. "There's a program designed to help children like you catch up on school. You can study in the mornings and still have time to sell flowers in the afternoon. It's flexible and tailored to your needs." Marcia hesitated, the weight of doubt pressing against her chest. "Do you think I can do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rodrigo, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. His voice was firm but kind. "Marcia," he said, meeting her gaze, "I know you can. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You've faced challenges most people couldn't even imagine, and you've come out stronger every time. This is just another step forward." Marcia's eyes filled with emotion. his words touching something deep within her. "But what about my family, my brothers, my mother? They still need me." Anna reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Marcia's shoulder. "We'll be here to support you," she said. "Donna Helena has already arranged for food and supplies to be delivered to your home regularly, and your mother's care will continue at the clinic. You won't be alone." Marcia glanced between Anna and Rodrigo, her heart torn between the familiar weight of responsibility and the unfamiliar hope of a brighter future. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll try," she said softly. "I'll do my best." Rodrigo's face lit up with a rare smile. "That's all anyone can ask." The following week, Marcia attended her first class at the community center. The room was small but welcoming, filled with children of various ages who shared similar stories of hardship. Marcia felt out of place at first, her nerves nearly overwhelming her. But as the teacher began to speak, explaining concepts with patience and care, Marcia found herself drawn in. By the end of the lesson, she was scribbling notes with a focus she hadn't felt in years. Her confidence grew with each passing day, and soon, Marcia began to believe in herself in a way she never had before. Her mornings became dedicated to school, where she worked diligently to catch up on her education. In the afternoons, she returned to her market stall, greeting customers with a smile and offering them the vibrant flowers she had carefully arranged. Her brothers often joined her, helping her tend the stall and learning from her determination. Rodrigo stopped by often, his visits becoming a source of encouragement for Marcia. He marveled at her progress, from the way she juggled her responsibilities to the newfound spark of confidence in her demeanor. "You're doing amazing," he told her one day, leaning against the stall as she handed a bouquet to a smiling customer. Marcia glanced at him, her smile bright. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. Rodrigo shook his head. "You've always had it in you, Marcia. I just gave you a little push." Weeks turned into months, and the changes in Marcia's life were undeniable. Her mother's health improved steadily under the care of the clinic, her brothers thrived with the support of the community center, and Marcia herself blossomed into a confident young woman with a clear vision for her future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Marcia sat at her market stall, reflecting on how far she had come. The hardships she had endured had shaped her, but they no longer defined her. With Rodrigo, Donna Elena, and Anna by her side, she had built a support system that gave her the strength to dream again. "I'm going to do it," she said aloud, her voice firm with determination. "Do what?" Rodrigo asked, appearing at the stall with his usual timing. "Finished school," Marcia replied, her eyes shining with resolve. "And after that, I'm going to find a way to help others, just like you helped me." Rodrigo's smile was proud and genuine. "I have no doubt you will." And as the city lights flickered to life around them, Marcia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building a future, one step at a time. The days turned into weeks, and Marcia's life found a rhythm she had never known before. Each morning, she woke early, packing her school books and a small lunch before heading to her classes at the community center. The lessons were challenging, but Marcia discovered a love for learning she hadn't realized she possessed. Numbers, words, and ideas that once seemed distant began to make sense, and with each passing day, she grew more confident in her abilities. In the afternoons, she returned to her market stall, arranging flowers with care and greeting customers with a warmth that was infectious. Her little corner of the market became a bright spot for many, with regular patrons stopping by not just for her flowers, but for a smile and a chat. Her brothers often helped, their laughter filling the air as they learned the trade under her patient guidance. At home, the change was just as profound. Marcia's mother, now receiving consistent medical care, grew stronger with each passing day. The hollow look in her eyes was replaced with a soft glow, and her once weak voice now carried a gentle strength. She often sat by the window, watching her children with pride as they worked together to rebuild their lives. One evening, as Marcia helped her mother settle into bed, her mother reached for her hand. "You've been so brave, my daughter," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Marcia smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We'll be okay, Mom," she replied, squeezing her mother's hand gently. "I promise." The transformation in Marcia's life did not go unnoticed. The girl who had once wandered the streets with a basket of flowers and a heavy heart was now a beacon of hope for those around her. Rodrigo, who continued to check in on her, often marveled at her resilience and growth. "You're incredible, Marcia," he said one afternoon as he visited her stall. The sunlight glinted off the petals of the freshly cut roses she had arranged. "You're building a better life for your family." Marcia looked up from her work, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for believing in me," she said sincerely. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Rodrigo shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "You had it in you all along, Marcia. I just gave you a little nudge." The market was bustling on a bright Saturday morning, the air filled with the mingling scents of fresh produce and Marcia's vibrant blooms. She stood behind her stall, her hands deftly tying ribbons around bouquets while greeting customers with her signature warmth. As she handed a small bunch of daisies to a young boy, she caught sight of Rodrigo approaching. His presence was as commanding as ever, yet there was an easy familiarity between them now. "How's school?" he asked, leaning casually against the stall. Marcia chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's hard," she admitted, "but I like it. I'm learning so much." Rodrigo smiled, a rare softness in his expression. "I knew you would. You're going to do amazing things, Marcia." Her cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment, but her smile widened. "One step at a time, right?" Rodrigo nodded, his gaze drifting to the flowers displayed on her stall. "I'll take a rose," he said, pointing to a particularly vibrant one. Marcia selected the bloom with care, handing it to him with a knowing look. "This one's on the house," she said teasingly. Rodrigo raised a brow but accepted the rose without protest. "Well, let it slide this time," he replied, his tone light. "But only because it's you." As the day wore on, Marcia took a moment to pause, leaning against her stall and surveying the bustling marketplace. The sounds of laughter, bartering, and the occasional shout of a vendor filled the air, but to Marcia, it was all a backdrop to the quiet pride blooming within her. She glanced at the rose Rodrigo had taken, now tucked neatly into the pocket of his suit, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Her journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, and the path forward was anything but easy. But for the first time, she felt truly equipped to face whatever came her way. She had found strength in herself, hope in her future, and support in those who believed in her. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the marketplace, Marcia straightened her shoulders and smiled. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. And as she handed a rose to the next customer, her heart swelled with pride, knowing that her flowers weren't just blooms. They were symbols of resilience, hope, and the life she was building, one petal at a time.